It didn't appear on any map because it wasn't a place. It was a condition. A state of being caught between the river's grey sigh and the iron lament of the railroad bridge. Fog was the architect of this condition, erasing the hard lines of the Kansas prairie and leaving only suggestions, the ghost of a cottonwood, the murmur of unseen water, the looming geometry of the trestle overhead. Beneath it, the world was close and damp. The air tasted of rust and wet stone. Mai moved through this colorless world with a quiet economy of motion that hunger teaches. Her light brown prairie dress, patched at the elbow and frayed at the hem, was dark with moisture. It clung to her slight frame, a second, colder skin. Beside her, padding with a soft, steady rhythm, was Bao. The dog's golden coat was muted to the color of wet straw in the gloom, his breath pluming in small, white clouds. He was her only inheritance, the single warm, living thing left from a life that had ended a year ago with a mine collapse and a letter of condolence written in a language she was still learning to read. They were looking for anything of value. A lost tool dropped by a Gandhi dancer. A washed-up piece of milled lumber. Even the thick, dark mushrooms that sometimes grew on the shaded pilings could be sold for a few cents in town, enough for a sack of flour. The dog's nose was better than her eyes in this soup. He worked the scree slope at the river's edge, his tail giving a hopeful twitch now and then, but mostly held low. The bridge was a colossal thing, a monument to noise and progress that punctuated her silent days with its passing thunder. Its stone abutments were massive, quarried blocks fitted together with a precision that seemed alien in the wild landscape. They were slick with moss and beaded with condensation. Mai ran a hand over the cold, rough surface, her fingers tracing the mortar lines. It was here, in the deep shadow where the stone met the earth, that Bao stopped. He didn't bark. He let out a low, guttural whine, a sound of profound confusion. His head was cocked, one ear up, the other flattened against his skull. He pawed at the ground, not with the frenzied digging of a dog on a scent, but with a hesitant, questioning motion. Mai knelt beside him, pushing his great, gentle head aside. "What is it, boy?" she murmured, her voice a soft thing, easily swallowed by the fog. The ground here was different. Everywhere else, the earth was a jumble of loose rock, mud, and hardy weeds. But here, in a perfect 4-foot square, the ground was level. Packed hard. And dry. It was utterly wrong. A patch of impossible order in the chaos of the riverbank. She pressed her palm against it. It was firm, unyielding, and strangely resonant, as if she were touching the skin of a drum. She used her fingers first, scraping at the edges. Dirt and small pebbles gave way to a thin, straight line. A seam. Her heart gave a sharp, painful knock against her ribs. This wasn't natural. She took the small trowel she carried in her satchel, a tool for digging up roots, and began to work at the seam with methodical patience. The trowel's tip scraped against metal. Not the dull clang of hitting a rock, but a higher, clearer sound. An hour passed. The fog thickened, muffling the world even further. Her fingers were numb with cold, her knees soaked. But she had cleared the perimeter. Before her, set flush with the packed earth, was a square of riveted iron plate, pitted with rust but solid. In its center was a recessed ring, thick as her wrist. A handle. It was a hatch. Here. Under a railroad bridge in the middle of nowhere. It made no sense. A root cellar? Unlikely. Too close to the river, it would flood with every spring thaw. A storm shelter? Perhaps, but the construction felt too deliberate, too hidden for that. This was meant to be secret. She hooked the fingers of both hands through the iron ring and pulled. Nothing. It was sealed by weight and time. Bao whined again, pressing against her side, his unease a palpable thing. She repositioned herself, planting her worn boots firmly, and leaned back, putting her entire body into the effort. Her muscles screamed. The tendons in her neck stood out like cords. For a moment, she thought it was hopeless. Then, with a deep, groaning screech of metal on stone, something gave. Slowly, agonizingly, the hatch lifted. It moved on huge, concealed hinges, its weight immense. She heaved it upward until it was past the tipping point and it fell back with a deafening clang that echoed under the trestle. She stared into the opening. Darkness. A perfect, silent, absolute black. A column of cold, still air rose to meet her, carrying a scent she couldn't place. It wasn't the smell of decay or rot. It was the clean, sterile scent of deep earth, of stone that had not seen the sun in 1,000 years. And something else. A faint, sharp tang of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. Bao backed away, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He would not go near it. Mai hesitated, her mind racing. This could be a grave. A bandit's cache. A forgotten well. Every instinct for self-preservation told her to close the heavy lid and walk away, to forget this patch of unnatural ground. But curiosity was a kind of hunger, too. And she was starving. From her satchel, she took a small tin of matches and a stub of a candle. She lit the wick, cupping the tiny flame with her hand, and lowered it into the opening. The light flickered, then steadied, revealing the top rungs of an iron ladder descending into the void. The rungs were not rusted. They were clean, as if they had been wiped down recently. Someone had been here. Someone was still coming here. The thought should have terrified her. It did, on some level. But the sheer strangeness of it overrode her fear. She looked back at the grey, featureless fog, at the empty riverbank. There was nothing for her out there but more of the same slow, grinding poverty. Down there was an answer to a question she hadn't even known to ask. Stay, she commanded the dog, her voice firm. Bao sat, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the black square. She secured her satchel over her shoulder, took a deep breath of the damp, river-scented air, and swung her legs over the edge. Her boot found the first rung. It was cold and solid beneath her sole. She descended, one rung at a time, leaving the grey world behind and sinking into the quiet, patient dark of the earth. The ladder was longer than she expected. 20 rungs, she counted, each one a small act of faith. Her world shrank to the small circle of her candle flame and the feel of the cold iron in her hands. Finally, her foot touched a solid floor. She stood still for a long moment, letting her eyes adjust, holding the candle high. The light pushed back the darkness, revealing a small, square room. The walls were not dirt, but neatly fitted stone, the same grey granite as the bridge abutments above. The floor was packed earth, as hard and level as the hatch cover. It was dry. Impossibly dry. She could hear the faint, steady drip of water somewhere far away, but here, the air was still and cool. It was a workspace. Against one wall stood a narrow cot, neatly made with a single grey wool blanket. At its foot was a small, sturdy wooden chest. Against the opposite wall was a draftsman's table, its surface tilted at a slight angle. A high stool was tucked beneath it. On the table, objects were arranged with a watchmaker's precision: calipers, a set of polished geology hammers, a spool of fine copper wire, and a small, brass-cased compass. There was no dust. Not a speck. This was not an old, forgotten place. It was an active one. Her gaze fell on a shelf above the table. On it sat a beautiful oil lantern with a clean glass chimney and a full reservoir of kerosene. Beside it, a box of fresh matches. A silent invitation. She blew out her candle stub and carefully lit the lantern. A bright, steady, golden light bloomed, filling the room and chasing the shadows into the corners. The warmth from the lantern was a small comfort against the subterranean chill. She moved toward the table, her steps hesitant, feeling like an intruder in a sacred space. Who would build such a place? And why? The precision of it all spoke of an educated mind, a patient hand. This was the work of an engineer, a surveyor, a man of science. She ran her fingers over the cool, smooth surface of the table. There were faint scratches in the wood, geometric patterns, and lines of calculation. On the corner of the table lay a book. It was a ledger, bound in dark green leather, the cover bare except for a single, blind-stamped initial H. She opened it. The pages were filled with dense, neat script, written in a steady, methodical hand. It wasn't a diary of personal thoughts, but a log. Log 417. The 90 for freight. Iron ore consignment. Vibration amplitude consistent with prior readings. Frequency stable at 12 Hz. No anomalous resonance. Log 418. The 1122 passenger express. Lighter load. Higher frequency, 15 Hz, amplitude decreased by 7%. The harmonic decay remains puzzling. Page after page of the same. Dates, times, train designations, and columns of numbers measuring frequencies, amplitudes, resonance. The man who lived here wasn't hiding from the trains. He was studying them. He was using the bridge itself as a colossal instrument, and the trains as the bow drawn across its strings. She turned a page and found a diagram. It was a cross-section of the earth beneath the bridge. It showed the river, the silt, the layers of shale and limestone. And deep below, a complex network of lines and symbols she didn't recognize. The diagram was annotated with the same precise script. Telluric current fluctuations correlate with locomotive mass. The quartz seam acts as a focusing lens. The question is not if, but when the alignment will be perfect. He wasn't just studying the trains. He was studying what the trains did to the earth beneath them. Her eye scanned the small room again, this time with a new understanding. The geology hammers were not for construction, they were for taking samples. The copper wire was for some kind of electrical apparatus. This whole, secret chamber was an observatory. A laboratory dedicated to a singular, obsessive purpose. A low sound from above startled her. A soft scratching, then a worried whine. Bow. He was still waiting for her. The sound connected her back to the world above, the world of fog and hunger. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. She had been so absorbed, she had forgotten him. She had forgotten everything but the mystery of this room. She looked at the wooden chest at the foot of the cot. It was not locked. She knelt and lifted the lid. Inside were simple provisions, tins of salted beef, hardtack biscuits, a canister of tea, a bag of coffee beans. And beneath them, several more journals, a box of spare lantern wicks, and a folded sheaf of photographs. She picked up the photographs. They were tintypes, their images stark and strangely beautiful. The first was of the bridge under construction, a skeleton of wood and iron surrounded by ant-like figures of men. Another was a portrait of a man. He was in his late 40s, perhaps, with a high forehead, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that seemed to look past the camera at something far away. He wore a simple suit, but his hands were the hands of a man who worked, strong, calloused. The initials etched on the journal suddenly had a face. The last photograph was different. It wasn't of a person or a bridge. It was a picture of a rock. A crystalline structure, photographed with such care that every facet and fracture was visible. It glowed with an internal light, as if it had captured a piece of the moon. Scrawled on the back in that same neat script was a single word, hypothesis. She put the photographs back, her hands trembling slightly. This man, H, had dedicated his life to this secret place, to this singular, esoteric study. He had built this room, furnished it, and pursued his work with a monk-like devotion. But where was he now? The room was clean, the supplies stocked, the ink in the inkwell still wet. It was as if he had just stepped out and would be back at any moment. A draught of cold air touched the back of her neck. She turned slowly. It came from a section of the stone wall behind the draftsman's table. She ran her hands over the blocks. One of them felt different. It wasn't as cold as the others, and when she pushed, it moved. There was a low grinding sound, and a section of the wall, a perfect 3-foot square, swung inward, revealing another passage. This one was not man-made. It was a natural fissure in the rock, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The air flowing out of it was colder still, and it carried that same faint, electric smell, only stronger now. The journal entries, the diagram, the photograph, it all pointed down this narrow crack in the earth. The focus of HS work was not in this room. This room was merely the antechamber. She held the lantern up to the opening. The stone walls of the fissure were smooth, water-worn, and they glittered with tiny flecks of mica that caught the light. The passage sloped gently downward, disappearing into the darkness beyond the lantern's reach. She hesitated for only a second. The mystery was a hook, and it was lodged deep. She squeezed through the opening, holding the lantern out in front of her. The passage was tight, the rough stone scraped against the fabric of her dress. After 10 feet, it opened into another chamber, this one larger than the first, and circular, like a natural grotto. Here, the work was laid bare. In the center of the grotto stood a strange device. It was a tripod of polished brass, and mounted on it was a complex assembly of copper coils, silvered mirrors, and cut-glass lenses, all aimed at one specific point on the far wall. Wires ran from this device to a series of glass jars filled with fluid and metal plates, primitive batteries. A telegraph key sat on a small crate nearby, its wires leading into the device itself. Mai approached the far wall. It was different from the rest of the grotto. A wide, vertical seam of rock, 6 feet high and 2 feet across, ran from floor to ceiling. It was not granite. It was a semi-translucent crystalline formation, the color of milky quartz, but shot through with thin, dark veins of an unknown mineral. It looked like a frozen waterfall. She reached out and touched it. The surface was glassy smooth and strangely warm, humming with a barely perceptible vibration, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. She understood. This was it. This was the hypothesis from the photograph. The bridge, the trains, the meticulous logs, it was all about this. H hadn't been studying the vibrations, he'd been studying their effect on this rock. He believed the rhythmic, percussive force of the trains passing overhead, channeled and focused by the geology of the land, was doing something to this crystalline seam. He was trying to measure it, to understand it, perhaps even to trigger it with his own strange machine. She went back to the antechamber and retrieved the main journal. She flipped to the last entry. The date was only 3 days ago. Log 621. The 312 cattle train. Maximum sustained load. The resonance is building. The harmonic cascade is imminent. The calculations suggest the next major freight shipment, with the new locomotive-specific axle weight, will be the catalyst. The fog is heavy tonight. Excellent. It will diffuse the light. Diffuse the light. A deep, low rumble began, a vibration that came not through the air but up through the soles of her feet. It started as a tremor, a faint shudder in the stone, and grew steadily, a rising crescendo from deep within the earth. A train was coming. Her heart hammered in her chest. Bow. He would be terrified. She had to get back. But she couldn't move. She was pinned by the same obsessive curiosity that had driven the man called H. He had waited for this moment, perhaps for years. He had missed it by 3 days. She was here to witness it for him. It felt like a duty. Quickly, she turned down the lantern's wick until the flame was a tiny blue bead, plunging the grotto into near-total darkness. The only light was the faint, ghostly outline of the passage back to the first room. The rumbling grew louder, becoming a physical presence. The stone floor vibrated beneath her. The glass jars of the battery began to hum. The very air seemed to thrum with a powerful, contained energy. She looked at the crystalline seam in the wall. It was still dark, inert. The sound of the train was almost on top of her now, a deafening roar of steel wheels on steel rails, the chuffing of the steam engine, the shriek of the whistle. It was a sound she had heard 1,000 times, but from down here, it was transformed. It was not a sound, it was a force of nature, a geological event. The grotto shook. Small pebbles skittered from the ceiling. Then, through the opening to the ladder shaft, she saw it. A single, brilliant point of white light, piercing the gloom. The train's headlight. It was directly overhead, cutting a swath through the dense fog, a cyclopean eye in the colorless void. At that exact moment, as the full weight of the locomotive passed over, the crystalline seam in the wall began to glow. It started as a faint, internal luminescence, a soft, blue-white light, like moonlight seen through deep water. As the train's thunderous passage continued, the light intensified, pulsing in perfect rhythm with the clacking of the wheels on the rails. 1-2. 1-2. A slow, steady heartbeat of light. The dark veins within the crystal began to glow as well, but with a different color, a deep, spectral violet. The light filled the grotto, casting her own stark shadow against the far wall. It was a light with no heat, a silent, beautiful, impossible fire locked in stone. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was a secret conversation between the machine and the earth, and she was the sole observer. The noise from the train was immense, a physical assault, but the light was utterly silent. It was pure. In that moment, the hunger, the cold, the grief of her own small life, all of it fell away. There was only the roaring darkness and this silent, pulsing heart of light. The last car passed. The thunder began to recede, the vibrations lessened, and with them, the glow in the rock began to fade. The pulses grew weaker, the light dimmer, sinking back into the stone as if being reabsorbed. Within a minute, it was gone. The grotto was dark and silent once more, the only sound the faint dripping of water and the frantic beating of her own heart. She stood frozen in the dark for a long time. The train was gone, its whistle a faint, lonely cry in the distance. The world had returned to normal. But she had been changed. She had seen something that nobody else had seen, something that H had spent his life searching for. Slowly, she made her way back to the main chamber and turned up the lantern's wick. The warm, yellow light felt mundane, inadequate, after the cold, blue fire in the grotto. She looked at the draftsman's table, at the open journal, at the precise, steady script. She was no longer just a poor widow scavenging for scraps. She was the keeper of a secret. A custodian of a quiet miracle. H was gone, for reasons she might never know, but his work remained. Incomplete. The last entry spoke of a catalyst, but not the result. He had predicted the light, but he had not seen it. Her gaze fell on the pen resting in its inkwell beside the journal. The ink was still dark and wet. The page was open, waiting. A new log number was already written at the top of the next page, log 622. She thought of the world above. The endless fog. The cold river. The small, empty cabin that barely kept out the wind. There was nothing for her there. Nothing but a slow fading. Down here, there was purpose. There was a question that needed an answer. There was a legacy waiting to be claimed. She walked to the base of the ladder and called up into the darkness. Bow. A happy bark answered her from the world above. She went back to the table. She pulled out the stool, its legs scraping softly on the packed earth floor. She sat down, her movement slow and deliberate. She picked up the pen. The wood was smooth and cool against her fingers. She dipped the nib into the inkwell, the small click of glass on glass the only sound in the silent room. Then, in the empty space below log 622, in her own careful, hesitant hand, she began to write. The light was blue.